Yeah. It's snow here, but how long it lasts, I don't know. How's where this goes? Something going down there. You are right. This seems to go up to the instead of here. So here is where we're spending holidays. He is very happy. Snow here. And he has hardly any voice. But he was barking yesterday. Hours. So she has no voice left. Where did you end up? Well, it's going to be dark soon. This is midwinter. 21st. Well, happy midwinter to you all. You feel not guys, you just get ice underneath. Honey and forest. Down here's the main road. Okay, good one. Okay, so on the other side of the road is the nature reserve. I can feel my feet are slipping every step. Rather good driving here though. But when we came here, we were driving and I thought it was straightforward on the other road. We're turning in. And I thought it fast this time, no dogs. I was like, okay, doesn't sound like the place, and I thought it was the cottage beside the house. I was wrong. Yeah. In the middle of the road, I'm not. Is that good? You think? Is that good, you think? Oh, push me now. Push me now. Not entirely sure what is a good idea. So we went to the little village to see what was there. And they had a gas station, which was really good. And the shop, convenience store. So we are set. We have a lot of food with us left. So the nature reserve here, which we will be scouring, we will be walking quite a lot in it. The nature reserve is called Svartåns naturreservat. That almost became for English. Svartåns naturreservat. In English that would be Black Creek Nature Reserve. And we already found one of the paths in. And as far as I remember, on the maps, apart from the hill behind us. Yeah, by the way, there is the cottage. In none of the pictures you could actually see the barn. So that was throwing me off. They actually have their own bus stop. And there should be a road going in here. Wonder. Yeah, a lot of my tracks. So I wonder if that is the road going in there. Yeah, we have to see. Okay, we go this way. I thought it was a little house on the side there. I couldn't fathom how to get there. And then I realized, wait a minute. There should be a light road. To the left of the entrance. And that house is like that. And then there should be a blue something, container outside. And that house like that. Realized, wrong house. And also the sound noodles. I'm thinking that there have been potholes with them. Loose dogs or something have gone over. Sad. Anything something? Yeah. Don't know the people involved, so. Looks like that I had like a big dog camp there, right next to it, but no dogs. Yeah, it's ruined completely. Så här är det. Let's stay in here. Huh? Beehives. Yeah. Oh, check it out, huh? Yeah, there's a place for you. There's the most forest. Yeah, it's not alone. Yeah, it's quite wet outside. It could be that we are losing the snow there. I'm not happy. It's just above freezing. But it's not good.